You ever feel like you're doing everything right? Checking all the boxes, ticking off the to-do list, yet deep down there's this gnawing emptiness that won't go away? Like you're climbing a ladder only to realize halfway up that it's leaning against the wrong wall. You wake up in the morning with a weight in your chest, go through the motions of your day, achieve what you set out to achieve. But when you lay your head down at night, there's this quiet whisper that says, "Is this really it?" Your relationships feel surface level, your work feels mechanical, and that sense of purpose you thought would arrive once you reached certain milestones remains frustratingly out of reach. You look around and see people who seem to have it figured out, radiating a sense of peace and fulfillment that feels like a foreign language to you, and you wonder what you're missing, what secret ingredient they possess that continues to elude you. This feeling isn't just frustration, it's a profound disconnection from your deepest self, and it affects everything. Your creativity stagnates because you're too exhausted from performing the role everyone expects of you. Your relationships suffer because you can't show up authentically when you don't even know who you authentically are anymore. Your career becomes a prison of golden handcuffs, paying the bills but starving your soul. You find yourself snapping at loved ones over minor things because the real issue, the gaping hole where meaning should be, is too terrifying to address directly. You scroll through social media at 2 a.m, feeling simultaneously connected to thousands and utterly alone, wondering if anyone else feels this existential vertigo, or if you're uniquely broken. The worst part is that you've tried the usual fixes: more productivity, more achievements, more possessions, more distractions, but none of it touches the core problem. You're running on a treadmill set to maximum speed, burning calories but getting nowhere, and the exhaustion is starting to show in ways you can't hide anymore. The most revolutionary discovery Abraham Maslow made wasn't about basic human needs or survival instincts. It was about the 9 distinct phases every human being must navigate to reach what he called self-actualization, and why skipping even one phase or rushing through them creates a psychological fragmentation that makes genuine fulfillment impossible, no matter how successful you become externally. Maslow spent decades studying not the broken and neurotic, which was the fashion of his time in psychology, but the healthiest, most fulfilled human beings he could find. And what he discovered was a roadmap so precise, so universally applicable, that it explained why some people radiate purpose while others achieve everything and feel nothing. Today I'm going to show you these 9 phases exactly as Maslow documented them, the specific signs that you're in each phase, the traps that keep people stuck for decades, and most importantly, how to navigate this ascension process authentically so you can finally access that sense of meaning and connection that's been missing. This isn't about positive thinking or productivity hacks. This is about understanding the actual architecture of human psychological and spiritual development, and once you see it, you can't unsee it. Maslow's journey into this discovery began in 1943, when he published his initial theory of the hierarchy of needs. But what most people don't realize is that he spent the next 27 years of his life refining and deepening that model until his death in 1970. The 9 phases I'm about to share emerged from his later work, particularly his studies of what he called peak experiences. Those moments of profound clarity, connection, and meaning that some people experience regularly while others never taste even once. He studied everyone from Eleanor Roosevelt to Albert Einstein, from highly creative artists to deeply fulfilled everyday people, looking for patterns in how they developed psychologically and spiritually. What he found contradicted nearly everything mainstream psychology believed at the time. The prevailing view was that human beings were driven primarily by the need to reduce tension, to find homeostasis, to achieve a steady state of comfort, and then maintain it. But Maslow's healthiest subjects weren't interested in steady states. They were growth-oriented, constantly expanding, perpetually curious, and they reported that their greatest satisfaction came not from achievement itself, but from the process of becoming more fully themselves. The first phase Maslow identified is what he called biological awakening, and it's not as simple as just having your basic needs met. This phase is about developing a conscious, grateful relationship with your physical existence, recognizing your body not as a machine to be exploited, but as the sacred vessel through which you experience reality. Most people never complete this phase because modern culture teaches us to treat our bodies as obstacles to productivity rather than sources of wisdom. Maslow found that individuals who remained disconnected from their physical experience, who ate unconsciously, who ignored fatigue, who numbed physical sensations with substances or distractions, inevitably struggled in every subsequent phase. The body holds emotional memory, trauma, and also joy, and learning to listen to its signals is the foundational skill for all later development. In one of his case studies, Maslow documented a businessman named Richard who had achieved remarkable financial success by his early 30s, but suffered from chronic anxiety and insomnia. Through therapeutic work, Richard discovered he had been unconsciously holding his breath during stressful moments since childhood, creating a constant state of physiological alarm. When he learned to breathe consciously, to feel his feet on the ground, to notice hunger and fullness rather than eating mechanically at his desk, something fundamental shifted. He described it as finally arriving in his own life, after decades of watching it from a distance. This biological awakening isn't indulgent or selfish. It's the necessary foundation for everything else, because you cannot transcend what you haven't first inhabited. The second phase is safety consolidation, and here's where Maslow's insights get particularly nuanced. This isn't just about physical safety or financial security, though those matter. It's about developing an internal sense of safety, a nervous system that isn't constantly scanning for threats, a psychological foundation stable enough to support risk and growth. Maslow noticed that many outwardly successful people were operating from constant fear, using achievement as armor against an underlying terror of inadequacy or abandonment. These individuals could never relax into joy because their nervous systems were perpetually braced for catastrophe. True safety consolidation means you've processed enough of your early trauma that your baseline state is one of okayness rather than anxiety. You can tolerate uncertainty without collapsing into panic. You can experience conflict in relationships without interpreting it as total rejection. You can take professional risks without your entire identity being on the line. One of Maslow's subjects, a woman named Dorothy, described this phase as finally exhaling after holding her breath her entire life. She had grown up in an unstable home where her parents' moods were unpredictable and sometimes violent. By her 40s, despite a stable marriage and career, she realized she was still living as if disaster was always around the corner, never fully investing in anything because she expected it to be taken away. Through deep therapeutic work and what Maslow called corrective emotional experiences, relationships where she was consistently met with stability and care, Dorothy's nervous system slowly learned that the world could be safe. She stopped hoarding resources out of fear and started spending them on experiences that brought joy. She stopped preemptively ending relationships before they could hurt her and started showing up vulnerably. This phase can't be rushed, and attempting to skip it creates what Maslow called pseudo-self-actualization, people who look evolved on the surface but are internally terrified and fragile. The third phase is belonging embodiment, and this is where so many modern people get stuck. We live in a culture that glorifies independence and self-sufficiency to the point of pathology, and Maslow was adamant that genuine autonomy is impossible without first experiencing deep belonging. You cannot become a healthy individual if you've never felt truly part of a community, family, or tribe. This phase requires vulnerability, the willingness to be seen in your imperfection, to need others and allow yourself to be needed. Maslow studied indigenous cultures and noticed that their members often exhibited psychological health that eluded their Western counterparts, and he attributed much of this to the unbroken experience of belonging they maintained throughout life. In individualistic societies, we're taught that needing others is weakness, that we should be able to handle everything alone, and this creates profound isolation even when we're surrounded by people. True belonging embodiment means you've found or created your people, the ones who see you and celebrate you not despite your quirks but because of them. It means you've contributed to something larger than yourself and felt the deep satisfaction of being part of an interconnected whole. Maslow documented a school teacher named James who spent his 20s and 30s climbing the academic ladder, publishing papers, earning accolades but feeling increasingly empty. In his late 30s, he joined a weekly men's group, not for professional networking but for genuine connection, and initially he felt extremely uncomfortable with the emotional vulnerability required. Over time, as he learned to share his struggles and listen deeply to others, He experienced a sense of being held by community that he'd never known. He described it as a homecoming, and interestingly, his professional work improved not despite the time he spent in community but because of it. He was more creative, more resilient, more willing to take intellectual risks because he had a secure base of belonging to return to. Now here's where I want to pause for a moment, because I know this is hitting home for a lot of you watching right now. The loneliness epidemic we're living through isn't just about not having friends, it's about having lost the art of belonging, of showing up imperfectly and being received anyway. Have you ever felt like you're surrounded by people but still fundamentally alone, like you're performing a version of yourself rather than being yourself? And the gap between the two is exhausting. Leave a comment with this exact phrase: "I'm ready to stop performing and start belonging." Your honesty might be the permission someone else needs to admit the same thing. We're not meant to do this alone, and your willingness to name that reality has more power than you know. You're not broken for needing connection, you're human, and every single person who has genuinely thrived has done so within the context of authentic community. So go ahead, drop that comment, and let's build something real together. The fourth phase is what Maslow termed esteem integration, and this is distinct from the shallow self-esteem we hear about constantly. Esteem integration means you've developed a realistic, compassionate view of yourself that includes both your gifts and your limitations without inflating or deflating either. You've received enough genuine recognition from others that you're not desperately seeking validation, but you've also developed the capacity to validate yourself independent of external approval. Maslow noticed that people stuck before this phase were either arrogant, inflating themselves to compensate for inner emptiness, or self-deprecating, unable to acknowledge their genuine strengths. True esteem integration creates a stable sense of self-worth that doesn't fluctuate wildly based on circumstances. You can receive criticism without crumbling because you know your worth isn't determined by any single opinion. You can receive praise without becoming addicted to it because you're not using it to fill an internal void. One of Maslow's most fascinating case studies was a musician named Sarah who had exceptional technical skill but crippling stage fright. In therapy, she discovered that her self-worth was entirely contingent on perfect performances, and any mistake felt like evidence of total worthlessness. Through a process of what Maslow called unconditional positive regard, where she was consistently valued regardless of performance, Sarah slowly integrated a more stable sense of esteem. She began taking musical risks, improvising rather than rigidly following scores, and paradoxically, her performances became more powerful because they were authentic rather than desperate attempts to prove her worth. This phase requires both external validation from healthy sources and the internal work of befriending yourself, seeing yourself as you would a beloved friend rather than a project to fix or an enemy to defeat. The fifth phase is cognitive expansion, and this is where consciousness itself begins to transform. Maslow noticed that self-actualizing people thought differently than others, not just in content, but in structure. They were comfortable with paradox, able to hold multiple perspectives simultaneously without needing to collapse into certainty. They were curious rather than defensive when encountering ideas that challenged their worldview. They could think both analytically and holistically, zooming in on details and zooming out to see patterns with equal facility. Most importantly, they had transcended what Maslow called either-or thinking, the binary way of seeing the world that creates so much unnecessary conflict. Cognitive expansion means your mind becomes more flexible, more spacious, more capable of nuance and complexity. You stop needing everyone to agree with you because you understand that truth is often paradoxical and contextual. You become less interested in being right and more interested in understanding. Maslow studied a scientist named Michael, who initially approached research with rigid methodological purity, dismissing anything that didn't fit his paradigm as invalid. After a series of personal crises that shattered his certainties, Michael went through a profound cognitive expansion. He began integrating insights from philosophy, art, and indigenous wisdom traditions into his scientific work, and his research became exponentially more creative and impactful. He described it as moving from black and white vision to full color, where previously invisible dimensions of reality suddenly became accessible. This phase often involves what Maslow called a breakdown, that leads to a breakthrough, where your old way of thinking becomes untenable, and you're forced to evolve or stay stuck. The sixth phase is authentic autonomy, and here Maslow made a crucial distinction that most people miss. Autonomy isn't isolation or independence from others. It's freedom from compulsive dependence on external validation while remaining deeply connected. Authentic autonomy means you've developed such a strong internal compass that you can withstand social pressure, disapproval, even rejection without abandoning your values or vision. You're not reactive, constantly rebelling against authority to prove your independence, and you're not compliant, constantly conforming to gain approval. You've found a third way, staying true to yourself while remaining in loving relationship with others even when they disagree. Maslow's self-actualizing subjects displayed remarkable autonomy. They pursued unconventional paths, made unpopular choices, stood alone when necessary, but they did so without arrogance or contempt for those who chose differently. One woman Maslow studied, an artist named Helen, left a prestigious position at a university to create art full-time despite everyone telling her she was making a terrible mistake. She didn't leave with bitterness or drama. She simply knew with clarity that the path being offered wasn't hers to walk. Years later, her work was internationally recognized, but more importantly, she reported profound fulfillment regardless of external success because she had honored her authentic calling. Authentic autonomy requires incredible courage because it means you might disappoint people you love, you might be misunderstood or criticized, you might lose relationships or opportunities that were contingent on your compliance. But Maslow found that the alternative, living a life determined by others' expectations, inevitably led to depression, resentment, and what he called a neurosis of unfulfilled potential. The seventh phase is what Maslow called peak experience cultivation, and this is where spiritual ascension becomes undeniable. Peak experiences are moments of transcendent awareness, where the boundaries of your separate self become temporarily transparent and you experience profound unity with something greater. These can happen through nature, art, love, meditation, creative work, or spontaneously without any apparent trigger. Before this phase, peak experiences might happen randomly and be dismissed as odd moments or emotional highs. In this phase, you begin to understand them as glimpses of a deeper reality that's always available, and you start structuring your life to invite them more regularly. Maslow noticed that self-actualizing people had peak experiences far more frequently than others, not because they were special, but because they had cultivated the conditions that allow them to emerge. These conditions include presence, the ability to be fully in the moment without mental chatter drowning out direct experience. They include openness, the willingness to be surprised and awed rather than controlling everything. They include what Maslow called B-cognition, perceiving reality as it is rather than through the lens of your needs and fears. One of his subjects, a doctor named Thomas, described a moment while performing surgery where he suddenly experienced complete unity with the patient, the surgical team, the instruments, the entire field of awareness. Time seemed to stop, and he felt guided by an intelligence far beyond his individual knowledge. The surgery was flawless, and Thomas was forever changed by the experience. He began meditating, spending time in nature, creating space in his life for these moments of transcendence, and they began happening regularly. His patients noticed a quality of presence in him that was healing beyond the technical procedures he performed. Peak experience cultivation isn't about chasing spiritual highs. It's about becoming the kind of person who's available to the transcendent dimensions of ordinary life. The eighth phase is purpose crystallization, and this is where your life organizes around a central axis of meaning. Before this phase, you might have interests, talents, even passions, but there's a diffuse quality to how you spend your energy. In this phase, a clear through line emerges, a purpose that feels both deeply personal and larger than your individual needs. Maslow noticed that self-actualizing people were all purpose-driven, but their purposes varied widely. Some were oriented toward truth, spending their lives in scientific or philosophical inquiry. Some were oriented toward beauty, creating art that elevated human consciousness. Some were oriented toward justice, fighting systems of oppression. Some were oriented toward healing, whether physical, psychological, or spiritual. The specific content mattered less than the fact that they had found their unique assignment in the world and committed to it fully. Purpose crystallization doesn't mean you never doubt or struggle. It means you've touched something so real and meaningful that you're willing to organize your entire life around it. One man Maslow studied, a civil rights activist named David, described his purpose as emerging not from ego or ambition, but from a deep listening to what the world needed from him specifically. He had skills, experiences, and a perspective that uniquely positioned him to contribute to racial justice. And once he recognized that, every decision became simpler. He wasn't trying to do everything. He was doing his thing with wholehearted devotion. Maslow emphasized that purpose isn't found through intellectual analysis alone. It emerges from the integration of all previous phases. You can't know your purpose if you're disconnected from your body, unsafe in your nervous system, isolated from community, insecure in your esteem, rigid in your cognition, dependent on others' approval, or unavailable to transcendent experience. Purpose is the fruit of doing the earlier work authentically. The ninth and final phase is what Maslow called transcendent service, and this is the pinnacle of human development. Transcendent service means you've moved beyond even personal purpose to a state where you're a clear channel for something far greater than yourself. Your individuality doesn't disappear, but it becomes transparent, no longer obstructing the flow of love, creativity, healing, or whatever quality you're here to transmit. Maslow noticed that the most developed human beings he studied had a quality he struggled to name. They were simultaneously fully themselves and somehow egoless. They acted from a place of profound freedom because they weren't protecting or promoting a separate self. They gave without keeping score, not because they were self-sacrificing, but because giving and receiving had merged into one continuous flow. They responded to each moment with fresh presence rather than habitual patterns because there was no psychological baggage cluttering their perception. Maslow studied a woman named Marie who ran a small community center in an impoverished neighborhood. She had no fame, no wealth, no conventional markers of success, yet everyone who encountered her reported feeling seen, loved, and somehow more themselves in her presence. When Maslow interviewed her, she couldn't really explain what she did. She simply showed up each day, listened deeply to whoever appeared, and responded from a place of clear knowing. She wasn't trying to be spiritual or enlightened. She was just utterly available to life flowing through her. Maslow said she was one of the most self-actualized people he'd ever met, and she had no idea she was anything special. Transcendent service isn't about grand gestures or saving the world, though it can include those things. It's about being so deeply rooted in your true nature that your very presence becomes a gift. You're not trying to be loving or wise or compassionate. You simply are those qualities because you've removed the obstructions that were blocking them. Now let's return to that feeling you had at the beginning of this video, that sense of emptiness despite achievement, that quiet desperation that something essential is missing. What Maslow discovered through decades of research is that feeling isn't a problem to fix. It's a call to grow. It's your psyche telling you that you've outgrown your current level of development and need to ascend to the next phase. The reason nothing external can fill that void is because the void isn't external, it's developmental. You're being invited to evolve, and until you accept that invitation, no amount of success, relationships, possessions, or achievements will satisfy. The beautiful part is that the roadmap exists. Maslow gave us the 9 phases not as rigid stages to check off, but as a living process of becoming more fully human. Maybe you're realizing you never completed biological awakening, that you've been living in your head and ignoring your body's wisdom. Maybe you recognize that you've never felt truly safe, and that underlying anxiety has been driving choices that don't serve you. Maybe you see that you've been avoiding community because vulnerability feels too risky. But the cost of that avoidance is crushing loneliness. Maybe you're stuck in esteem issues, constantly seeking validation or unable to acknowledge your gifts. Maybe your thinking is rigid, unable to hold paradox or multiple perspectives. Maybe you're not truly autonomous, still living according to others' expectations. Maybe you've never had a peak experience or didn't recognize it as significant. Maybe you have talents and interests but no clear purpose organizing your life. Maybe you have purpose but haven't surrendered into transcendent service. Wherever you are in this process is exactly where you need to be right now, and acknowledging it honestly is the first step toward growth. Maslow's work gives me such hope, because it shows that human development isn't random or chaotic. There's an order to it, a natural unfolding that happens when we stop resisting and start cooperating with our own evolution. The reason some people seem to radiate fulfillment while others achieve everything externally and feel empty internally isn't that some people are chosen or special. It's that some people have done the developmental work that creates the internal foundation for genuine thriving. And here's what's truly revolutionary about Maslow's model: it's never too late. You can be 70 years old and just beginning biological awakening. You can be 25 and already in purpose crystallization. There's no timeline, no competition, no right pace. There's only your unique journey of becoming more fully yourself, which is simultaneously becoming more fully human, which is simultaneously becoming more fully divine. The spiritual ascension process isn't about leaving your humanity behind to become some ethereal being. It's about descending fully into your humanity, inhabiting every dimension of your experience so completely that the transcendent reveals itself within the ordinary. If you've made it this far in this video, it means something in you is ready for this work, ready to stop chasing external solutions to internal developmental needs, ready to engage the actual process of growth rather than just learning more concepts about growth. I want to invite you to continue this journey with us. This channel is dedicated to exploring the full depth of human potential through the lens of thinkers like Maslow, who studied the healthiest, most fulfilled human beings rather than just the pathological. Every week we go deep into one aspect of psychological and spiritual development, not to give you quick fixes or superficial tips, but to provide the kind of understanding that actually transforms lives. If you're tired of feeling like you're on the outside looking in at your own life, if you're ready to engage the developmental work that creates genuine fulfillment, then click that subscribe button and join this community of fellow travelers. We're all figuring this out together, and having companions on the journey makes all the difference. The bell icon means you'll be notified when we release new content, and trust me, you don't want to miss what's coming next. Speaking of which, if this exploration of the 9 phases resonated with you, the next video you absolutely need to watch is about Maslow's concept of peak experiences and how to cultivate them intentionally. We're going to go deep into the specific practices, mindsets, and life structures that invite transcendent awareness. Because understanding the 9 phases intellectually is one thing, but actually experiencing the transformation they describe requires direct contact with dimensions of consciousness that most people never access. That video will give you practical, actionable ways to open yourself to peak experiences so that spiritual ascension isn't just a concept, but a lived reality. You've taken the first step today by gaining this understanding. Now let's take the next step together into direct experience. I'll see you there.